They were warned it could explode. The warning was written down, passed between officials, and ignored until thousands of lives were altered in seconds, and responsibility dissolved into paperwork, silence, and legal immunity. The people who died were not soldiers or criminals. They were dock workers, firefighters, sailors, factory employees, families living near an industrial port that had been declared safe enough for routine operations. What killed them was not a single mistake, but a chain of decisions made long before the blast, decisions about profit, secrecy, and what risks were acceptable for ordinary people to absorb. The official record calls it an accident. Survivors, evidence, and later investigations suggest something closer to a systemic failure that no one was ever truly held accountable for. The victims were never supposed to be there that morning, but neither was the danger they were forced to live with. The port community depended almost entirely on shipping, petrochemicals, and manufacturing. Employment revolved around docks, rail spurs, fertilizer plants, oil refineries, and warehouses packed tightly together along the waterfront. Workers handled hazardous materials daily, often without full disclosure of their risks. Safety standards existed on paper, but enforcement varied depending on urgency, cost, and who was responsible. One of the most dangerous materials routinely moved through the port was ammonium nitrate. It was known to be unstable under certain conditions. Scientific literature before the disaster documented its potential to detonate when heated, contaminated, or confined. Several major industrial explosions involving ammonium nitrate had already occurred in other countries. These were not obscure incidents. They were discussed in engineering journals and government memoranda. Despite this, ammonium nitrate was treated primarily as cargo, not as a high explosive risk. It was packaged in paper sacks, stacked in ship holds without specialized ventilation, and transported through populated areas. Dock workers were not trained as explosive handlers. Firefighters were not equipped for chemical fires involving oxidizers that could detonate. The ship at the center of the disaster was a French-flagged cargo vessel transporting ammonium nitrate intended for export. The cargo had been produced domestically and was part of a larger government-approved program to distribute fertilizer abroad. The bags were marked with warnings, but those warnings were inconsistent and poorly understood. Some labels referred to flammability, not detonation. Others were in foreign languages. A fire broke out in the ship's hold while it was docked. The cause of the fire was never definitively determined. Theories range from a discarded cigarette to spontaneous heating, contamination, or improper stowage. What is certain is that the fire was visible for an extended period. Before the explosion, dock workers noticed smoke seeping from the hold. The ship's crew attempted to suppress the fire internally. Instead of unloading the cargo or flooding the hold with water, they used steam, a method sometimes used to smother fires, but dangerously inappropriate for ammonium nitrate under confinement. Steam increased heat and pressure, exactly the conditions known to increase the risk of detonation. Firefighters were called. They responded as they had been trained to fight a ship fire. They had no specialized knowledge of ammonium nitrate explosions. No evacuation order was issued for the surrounding area. Workers continued operations nearby. Families watched from shore. Children gathered to observe what appeared to be a routine emergency response. This was not a failure of bravery. Firefighters climbed aboard, knowing there was risk. It was a failure of information. No one in authority told them the cargo could explode with the force of a weapon. Firefighters were called. They responded as they had been trained to fight a ship fire. They had no specialized knowledge of ammonium nitrate explosions. No evacuation order was issued for the surrounding area. Workers continued operations nearby. Families watched from shore. Children gathered to observe what appeared to be a routine emergency response. This was not a failure of bravery. Firefighters climbed aboard, knowing there was risk. It was a failure of information. No one in authority told them the cargo could explode with the force of a weapon. When the ship detonated, the blast obliterated the vessel, the dock, and much of the industrial waterfront. The explosion registered as a seismic event. Shockwaves leveled buildings miles away. Fires ignited across the port as fuel tanks, refineries, and chemical plants were damaged or destroyed. Fragments of the ship were found miles inland. Steel beams were twisted into shapes normally seen only after military bombardment. The harbor was carved into a crater. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. The immediate death toll was impossible to calculate. Bodies were vaporized. Others were buried under rubble or burned beyond recognition. Many victims were never identified. Thousands were injured, many permanently. Emergency response collapsed. Fire stations had been destroyed. Police departments lost personnel and equipment. Hospitals were overwhelmed, some damaged beyond use. Medical staff worked without power, without supplies, performing amputations and surgeries under extreme conditions. What made the catastrophe worse was the chain reaction. A nearby vessel carrying sulfur caught fire and exploded hours later. Storage tanks ruptured. Chemical releases added toxic exposure to physical trauma. The port became an uncontrolled disaster zone. In the aftermath, the scale of destruction demanded answers. Survivors wanted to know why they had never been warned. Families wanted accountability for the firefighters and workers sent into a situation they could not possibly understand. Investigators began documenting the scene. They examined ship manifests, cargo handling procedures, communication logs, and training protocols. They found no evidence of sabotage. There was no proof of intentional wrongdoing in the traditional criminal sense, but they did uncover layers of negligence. Records showed that ammonium nitrate had been classified inconsistently across agencies. Some considered it low risk under normal conditions. Others had flagged it as a potential explosive. No unified safety standard existed for its maritime transport. Internal documents revealed that authorities knew steam suppression could be dangerous for certain chemical fires, yet no clear prohibition had been communicated to ship crews or port firefighters. Training manuals were vague. Responsibility was diffused across shipping companies, port authorities, manufacturers, and government agencies. The investigation also revealed that similar fires involving ammonium nitrate had occurred previously, without catastrophic outcomes. These near misses reinforced complacency. Each time disaster was avoided, the assumption grew stronger that existing practices were sufficient. Legal responsibility became the central issue. Lawsuits were filed against the shipping company, the manufacturer, and the government. Plaintiffs argued that the fertilizer was defectively packaged, improperly labeled, and negligently handled. They pointed to documented warnings, ignored at multiple levels. The most controversial defendant was the federal government. The fertilizer program had been government-directed. The material had been produced under federal contracts. Plaintiffs argued that the government's role made it directly responsible for the conditions that led to the explosion. The government invoked sovereign immunity, a legal doctrine shielding it from liability. Courts ultimately upheld this protection. Despite acknowledging that errors had occurred, judges ruled that policy decisions related to production and distribution were immune from civil claims. This legal outcome devastated survivors. It established that even when government actions contribute to mass death, accountability can be legally unreachable. No criminal charges were filed. No executives went to prison. No officials were dismissed for negligence. The disaster was classified as a tragic accident, not a prosecutable crime. Public reaction was intense. Media coverage exposed the scale of the destruction and the legal barriers preventing justice. Trust in industrial safety assurances eroded. Firefighters' organizations demanded better disclosure of hazardous materials. Communities questioned how many other ports operated under similar risks. Some changes followed. Labeling standards for hazardous materials improved. Firefighting protocols were updated to include chemical-specific guidance. International shipping regulations for ammonium nitrate became stricter over time. But these reforms came after the fact, driven by loss rather than foresight. What remains unresolved is the exact cause of the initial fire. No conclusive evidence identified a single ignition source. Critical records were destroyed in the blast. Witness accounts conflicted. Some survivors reported seeing flames deep within the hold, suggesting internal heating. Others believe the fire began near the deck, consistent with human activity. Another unanswered question involves decision-making authority. Who had the power to order the cargo unloaded or the area evacuated? Testimony suggested that no one individual believed they had that responsibility. Each deferred to another entity, creating a paralysis that lasted until the explosion made all decisions irrelevant. There is also the issue of prior knowledge. How many officials truly understood the explosive potential of ammonium nitrate? Some documents suggest awareness at higher levels. Others indicate that warnings were diluted as they moved through bureaucratic channels. This pattern: danger known, responsibility blurred, accountability denied, has repeated in later industrial disasters around the world. The same chemical would be involved in catastrophic explosions decades later, often under strikingly similar circumstances. The lesson was available early. It simply was not enforced. The Texas City disaster stands as one of the deadliest industrial catastrophes in history, not because the risk was unknowable, but because it was normalized. People lived and worked beside a threat that had been explained away by routine and authority. What failed was not a single system, but an entire culture of risk management that prioritized efficiency over transparency and treated human lives as acceptable collateral. The documents existed, the warnings were written, the danger was measurable, and still, no one stopped it. That is why the case remains disturbing, not for what exploded, but for what didn't: responsibility, justice, and the willingness to learn before it was too late.